In this video, we're going to do an overview of all the tools available to us inside of Resolve's Curves panel. And I'm going to show you how you can improve your grades by using these tools like a pro colorist. Okay, let's dive in and talk about all of the different tools that are available to us here inside of Resolve's Curves panel. So first thing that we're going to see when we open up this Curves panel is our custom curves. Now, these are one of my favorite tools within the Curves toolset, but we're actually going to hold off a second before we talk about these. We're going to circle back around to these and talk about them at the end, because even though they're one of my favorites, they're actually a bit of an outlier in terms of the logic and the terminology and the function of the other curve tools within this panel. So let's just do a quick flyby and look at all of the tools that we're going to be discussing in the next couple of minutes. So we have our Hue versus Hue, our Hue versus Sat, our Hue versus Lum, Lum versus Sat, Sat versus Sat, and Sat versus Lum. Okay, a couple things right off the bat. Is that a little overwhelming? Have you ever gone into this panel and thought, this could be fun, maybe I can do something interesting in here, but I don't even know where to begin. I'm not even sure I'm using the right curve for what I'm trying to accomplish. If so, don't worry, because I'm going to give you a really simple rule of thumb right now that's going to help you know which tool to pick and confirm that you have chosen the right tool for what you're trying to accomplish. Here's the really easy rule of thumb. All these tools that have this versus convention, which is all of them except for the custom curves, all you need to remember is this. They're all going to have a versus convention that says it's A versus B, something versus something else, right? It's always B. It's always something else. It's always the second of the two terms that you will actually be making a change to in your image. So as an example, Hue versus Lum, you're going to be changing luminance. Sat versus Lum, you'll also be changing luminance. Lum versus Sat, you'll be changing saturation. Again, reason is that these are all the second of the two terms. That's always what you're going to be manipulating. So what does that mean about the first of the two terms? What is the significance of that first term? The significance is that you are going to be making the manipulation of, for example, your luminance in your Hue versus Lum on the basis of hue. So the first term always tells you what you are going to be making your adjustment on the basis of, and the second one always tells you what you are actually going to be netting a change in your image, okay? So that's a logic that holds for all of these different versus tools, and there's a lot of logic that holds for all these that once you start to understand it, makes this tool set a lot more intuitive and a lot less overwhelming. So what are some other things that we can observe about all of these tools that we've looked at so far? Well, they all have a horizontal line, don't they? And the reason they all have a horizontal line is that they all follow the convention of an X versus Y graph. And all an X versus Y graph is a graph that describes output at a particular input. So you can see right now, the output of my Hue versus Hue matches the input all the way from left to right. No matter what my left to right input is, which is Hue, my output is unchanged, right? And what we're going to be doing as we go along here is we're going to start to make changes within specific input ranges to the output, okay? This will make a little more sense when we get hands-on, but I want to emphasize that that logic that I just summarized is why I think of the curves as my sort of favorite ideal form of secondary within Resolve's color page. Anytime I want to make an adjustment to not all of the image, but a portion of the image on the basis of color, the curves are where I start. There's usually a curve that is ideally suited to whatever I'm trying to do. And that's really the value prop of this panel, is once you begin to understand it, once you begin to understand its logic, it is one of the cleanest and effective and most efficient ways of making secondary manipulations to your image. Okay, let's start looking at these tools individually and talking about how they work. And by the way, we're going to do a dive on every single one of these tools in its own dedicated video, because they're really, really powerful tools and they deserve our full attention. But today I want to give you the overview of the general functionality of each so that we have kind of a map to work off of. We've got our bearings a little bit before we do the deep dive into any one of these tools. So we're going to start with our Hue versus Hue. Hue versus Hue, as we know, is going to adjust hue because the second term is hue. And it's either a little bit more confusing or a little bit simpler that both terms are the same, right? So what does that mean? That means we're going to be adjusting hue on the basis of hue. So let's look at a practical example here. Let's start by just looking at our presets that we have down here. I've got presets for red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, and yellow. okay? And let's say that I want to change the hue of the yellows in my image, and that's the only area of the image that I want to change. I could grab this yellow preset here and tap on it, and let's take a look at what we've got now. We've got these two goalposts here, and we've got a center point where we can make an adjustment. You can see that center point lines right up with the purest yellow here in this entire color wheel that's running from left to right, okay? And let's zoom in and look at our color patch here on the color checker, the yellow patch, and watch what happens when we drive this up. We are rotating its hue, right? You can even see it in the vector scope. We're rotating the hue of anything with yellow in it. And you can see when I use these presets, the adjustment is very broad and it's impacting a large area of the image. That's actually good because it's going to mean the adjustment is quite clean because it is quite broad in nature. We can get more narrow if we want to, but remember I talk about in my book, The Colorist 10 Commandments, broad beats narrow. We want to go as broad as we possibly can without affecting areas of the image that we don't want to. So this would be an example of using our presets and the goalposts that we're going to get out of it and that center control point where we can begin to adjust things, okay? Let's now look at what we would do if we wanted to make a narrower selection. I'm going to hit this little reset button here, and let's say we want to select our subject's skin. So I'm going to now eyedropper her skin as opposed to grabbing my presets here, and let's watch what happens. I'm getting the same sort of goalposts, but you can see they're much narrower in width, right? They're not spanning nearly the same amount of the hue wheel that they were a moment ago. And let's watch what happens. I can rotate the hue of my subject's skin either more greeny or more red. I also want to point out that this is a more touchy adjustment because it's narrower. I can go far enough and things start to break apart, right? So this is something you want to observe with all of the curves tools. Whenever you're making any adjustment, there are not very firm bumpers in place with any of these inside of Resolve's Curves panel. You need to provide your own bumper. You need to know when going too far is too far, and you need to keep an eye out for chatter like this as a result of getting too aggressive with your adjustment. But as long as you're staying within a sort of like more conservative range, you can affect these narrower areas much better. And let's look at this and say, we want something in between. We don't necessarily want those super broad goalposts, but we don't want something as narrow as this. Something I will often do after I've eyedroppered an area in any of my curves tools. And by the way, a lot of what we're talking about right now in hue versus hue, this is going to travel and the logic is going to apply as we continue looking at other tools in a moment. So we're going to spend a bit more time on this one because it gives us a chance to get familiar with some of these conventions that are going to hold for all the other tools. Let's say once I've drawn this sample area, I want to get a little bit broader. Well, what I can do is grab my goalposts and widen things out, like so. I'm just going to drag this to the left and to the right, like so. And something you want to watch out for when you do this is you want to keep an eye on these numerical fields down here. So when I tap on the control point for my left goalpost, for example, I have an input and an output. This is something else that will hold for all of our tools. We have, in this case, input hue and hue rotate. These terms will be specific to whatever tool we are operating in, but they really all mean the same thing. They all mean at this input, what do you want the output to be? And in the case of my goalposts, those are anchor points. Those are control points. So I want the output to be 0. I want to net no change to the hue of my image at those goalposts. And it's very easy to inadvertently rotate things just a little bit when we're dragging this control point off to the left or to the right. So what I like to do after I've widened my goalposts is just go in and manually key in zeros to make sure I'm not getting any unwanted rotation. It's subtle right now, but just take a look at what's actually happening. If I do this enough that it's visible, if I bring this control point up and I'm now rotating at 8 degrees, you can see I'm actually rotating the hue of most of the image, right? Like I'm having way more effect than on just this area inside of my goalposts. And that's really what we want to be doing when we're making our adjustments inside of the curves tools. We want to make an adjustment inside of a defined range. We don't just want to adjust the entire image. That would be more of a primary and less of a secondary, and really not something we would typically want to accomplish with our curves tool. I will point out, if we reset this, if we were to just draw no control points, just have a single control point, I am effectively rotating the hue of the entire image. I'm doing the exact same thing as if I were to grab the hue knob here inside of my primaries, okay? That's typically not what we want to do. So instead, we're going to draw control points and manipulate areas only inside of ranges that we've selected and finessed for whatever we're trying to do to the image. Okay? A few more things that we can talk about while we're here on this first of our curves. Let's just grab another preset here. And if I look at raising this control point up, we can see I've got this Editable Splines button that allows me to really finesse what I'm doing with this curve. This gets really useful when you're making small and more kind of like fine-tuned adjustments to your image. And it gets even easier to do if you use this four-way arrow to pop things out into the big curves mode. I don't know if that's the real name, but that's what I call it. And I really, really like it for making these more fine-tuned adjustments. All right, so this is something that you can do with any of the curve tools that we're going to go over. And it's really, really helpful for dialing in your adjustments. Once you've got your overall goalposts in place, you've generally got the right Y adjustment that you're making, and you just want to finesse things or soften things out a little bit more. Okay, we can reset this, and let's move on and start talking about some of these other curves tools available to us. So that's our hue versus hue, and what do we have next? We have our hue versus sat. So just as we did in our hue versus hue, we've got a color wheel. We've got a rainbow running from left to right. And something I want to point out here is for any of these versus tools where we have this left to right x-axis rainbow of hues, this actually runs in a circle. So we've already grabbed our yellow and some of our other presets down here below, but look at what happens if we grab our red. With our red, our goalposts are sort of skipping around this left edge. So this is actually my right goalpost here, and this is the left. And you can see that when I start to raise this control point up. And that's because in the convention of a hue wheel, as soon as we run up to the left edge of my hue input, it loops right back around to this side. You can even see the color here is the same as the color here. So hue runs in a circle, and it's important to remember that when we're doing any of our hue versus X type of manipulations, because they're all going to have this hue as their X input, and they're going to rotate around the beginning and the edge, or the left edge and the right edge of the graph as a result. Okay? But in the case of hue versus sat, let's take a look at, say, saturating our skin tone. I'm going to eyedropper my subject's skin again, and I'm going to boost this up. And I'm now selectively saturating just the area of the image that is within my goalposts, right? So again, great form of secondary of adjusting or affecting a change only in the area that I want to. So I'm making a change to saturation on the basis of hue, and the hue criteria is that we need to be in between, in this case, 266 and 294 degrees in order for the change to be adjusted. And again, we want to make sure that we have our saturation in this case, as opposed to our hue, set to a 1 for these goalposts, so that if we bump them, they're still having no effect outside of our area of interest here. Okay? What's next? Hue versus Lum. Okay, this is another hue versus something tool, right? Once again, we are going to be adjusting something, in this case, luminance, on the basis of hue. So in this case, if I want to darken a particular color, I could do that using hue versus Lum, or if I wanted to brighten a particular color for that matter. So let's just say, I don't know, let's say we want to darken our color patch here that I'm looking at. I'm just going to eyedropper to grab it. And if I start to pull this down, you can see it is indeed getting darker. And I could, of course, brighten it up as well. So that's our hue versus Lum. We're affecting luminance on the basis of hue. All the same rules apply and conventions apply that we've been talking about. Editable splines, presets for your primaries and secondaries, input and output numerical fields, and the ability to pop things out into a big curve. Something else that I'll point out that you might have noticed as we've gone through these first few curves is we have this histogram that is underlaying our graph, don't we? This histogram is telling us where there is lots of image information, very little image information, or a moderate amount of image information in the source image. And specifically, it's telling us how much information is in the hue channel. So you can see we have a large concentration of warm colors in the hue channel of the incoming image. This can be really handy for sort of navigating your adjustments and understanding what you're doing. And it can be helpful for assessing something like, oh, if you make an adjustment here within this area, we're probably not going to see much change because there's very, very little image data living in that portion. Another great example if you put a goalpost right on the peak of a histogram area, there's a much higher chance you're going to introduce noise or artifacts, because you're saying all of this image information is going to be manipulated and all of this image information is going to be left alone. And it's easier to kind of like tear those things apart from one another in a more noticeable way. Okay. So that's your histogram underlay that, again, is going to be consistent for all the different tools here inside of the curves panel. Let's keep going. Let's see what's next. Okay, Lum versus Sat. And something's changed here now, right? We're no longer looking at a hue X graph. What's happening on our X graph? What's happening horizontally? What's happening left to right? Well, it looks like we're going from dark, black, through gray, and all the way up to white, right? Which makes sense when we look at Lum versus Sat, because we can use our rule of thumb to remember that this Lum versus Sat curve is going to make an adjustment to saturation on the basis of what? Luminance, right? So luminance is our X input, saturation is our Y output. So for example, if I wanted to desaturate the bright areas of my image, I could grab this rightmost control point and drag it down. And now I'm going to be reducing the saturation to 0 of brighter things. And as things get darker, I'm going to have less and less effect until I go all the way to 0, where things are not being changed saturation-wise whatsoever. If I wanted to, for example, saturate things in the lower end of the image, in the shadow area of the image, I could grab this leftmost control point, and now I'm boosting the saturation of things down in that area. And of course, with any of these curves tools, I can use as many control points as I need or want to execute what it is that I'm trying to see, right? Only thing to be mindful of here is that we don't want to use any more control points than we need to. You want to use the bare minimum that you need in order to get what you're trying to accomplish within your image. Because the more you add, the more likely it is that you're going to create problems and the longer it takes to make the adjustment. So keep it as simple as you possibly can. Okay, same conventions here, editable splines, presets for your shadows and for your highlights, and your numerical fields, again, for input and output, even though the exact terminology may change from one curve tool to the next. Okay, let's take a look now at our Sat versus Sat. Okay, so our Sat versus Sat, this reminds me of the tool that we started our walkthrough on, their Hue versus Hue, right? We're affecting a channel on the basis of that channel. So we're changing our saturation channel on the basis of our saturation channel. So, practical example, if I wanted to boost my low saturations, I could grab this leftmost control point like that. Or if I wanted to drop my most saturated things and reduce their saturation, I could grab this control point. And again, I could, of course, articulate things with however many control points I wanted to use, like so. Okay? Everything else the same. Editable splines, input and output numerical fields, and all that's going to hold for this tool as well. Let's reset this and go to our last tool of the versus tools. That's going to be our Sat versus Lum. So Sat versus Lum, you're getting the hang of it now, I can tell, right? Lum is what you're going to be adjusting. Saturation is what you are going to be using as your criteria for that adjustment. So let's say we want to do something that is very filmy in nature, that feels like very photochemical. It's something that we really like about movies that are shot on film, which is that saturated stuff tends to get darker. If I want to do that, I could grab my rightmost control point and drop things down, like so. See how my colorful things are getting darker? I'm effectively making a gain adjustment to my image, but only in the areas that have lots of color. And if I wanted to change the shape of the way this kind of falls off or the way things descend, I could add another control point here and get a sort of more subtractive color system, like so. Okay? Last thing I'll point out here in this final of our versus curves is that we already talked about our histogram, but you can actually change the way that you monitor your histogram by going to your 3 dots here and setting your histogram instead of to input to output. And that simply means that that histogram is going to change as you make adjustments to your image. Some people find this handy for sort of looking at not what was the histogram of the image beforehand, but seeing what the histogram plot actually is now. I personally like to leave it on input, but you can experiment with both and see which works better for you in the adjustments and the grades that you're doing. Okay? All right, so that's all of our versus curves, and I hope you can start to see they have more in common than they have differences, right? Really, the only differences between these things is the channels that they are modifying and the channels that are being used for narrowing the modification, okay? But all the other conventions of the graph itself, the control points, the splines, the numerical fields, popping things out, the histogram, all that stuff is going to be pretty consistent from one tool to the next. And that's a big part of sort of killing that overwhelm that can often come when we're first playing around in this palette, is realizing like, oh, this is actually just a bunch of the same thing being repeated for the sake of organization and consistency within each of these tools. All right. Now let's circle back around all the way to where we started. Let's take a look at our custom curves here. These custom curves might be my favorite tool in this whole toolkit, as I mentioned, and there's a lot to them. This is going to require a full dive in a dedicated video if we really want to understand everything that's happening within these tools. But as with all the other tools that we're overviewing today, I really just want to give you your bearings and give you some context for what we're going to be covering in the later installments of this breakdown of the curves panel. And so the custom curves are in their own camp for a couple of reasons. The first one is pretty obvious by now. They're the only ones that don't have a versus convention. They're not given in the form of A versus B, right? Although interestingly, you could still think of these as a versus tool. These are effectively a Lum versus Lum curve. They're simply not styled that way for whatever reason within Resolve. Second thing, their graph looks a little bit different, right? Instead of running in a flat horizontal line, it runs diagonally from top to bottom. Although again, that's actually more a cosmetic thing than something that really indicates a difference in the way the tool fundamentally works. So instead of having a flat horizontal line representing no change, in this case, a flat diagonal line represents no change to the image, okay? Here's actually the biggest difference between the custom curves and all of these other tools. All of these other tools, as I mentioned earlier, I would consider to be secondaries, and that they are really designed, they really perform best when we are using them to make an adjustment to a specific area of our image, as opposed to all of our image. The custom curves, I don't see that same way. You can certainly affect only small portions of your custom curves without affecting the entire image, but that's not really their ideal use, in my opinion, just because if you look at something like grabbing this control point and dragging it upward, what am I doing here? I'm really just making a lift change in the image. This is really no different than if I were over here in my primaries palette, adjusting my lift, okay? So at their baseline, I like to think of the custom curves conceptually as lift gamma gain with more control. So you can do things, anything you can do in your primaries, you can do in your custom curves, and you can go further. Like let's say you make that lift adjustment, and you now want to, let's go and turn our editable splines off for now, but you now want to make a separate adjustment up in this area of the image. I don't really love what's happening here, but the point is that you can exert more control over the image than you can in your primaries. This is a shape you could not get out of your image. This is not something you can do using your primaries that you can do with your custom curves, okay? So there's more degrees of freedom, but it really is just a matter of primaries plus. So that's why I think of the custom curves more as a sort of like dialed in primary than as a strict secondary. And that's why I wanted to save this for last, because conceptually it's playing a different role in my workflow and in the way that I make my manipulations. And we'll talk about this when we do our deep dive, but the big trade-off here, the thing to be aware of with your custom curves is you get more control when you use them. You can control your image with more accuracy and more finesse than you can with your primaries. However, these custom curves aren't quite as fast as your primaries. It's tough to beat three wheels that you can grab and manipulate all three of in real time. Custom curves take a little bit more time to manipulate, so you can't reach for them for every shot. But when you need them, when you want that extra finesse, I find that to be invaluable for making that sort of like finessed type of primary adjustment to the image. So that's the basic idea here. A lot of the conventions that we looked at in our other curves are going to hold the same. We can create control points, we can sample our image and get control points on that image. There's a couple other things that are unique to the custom curves, such as the ability to option click and pin a control point to the unity line. We're going to talk more about that when we do our deep dive. And we also have the ability to manipulate not just all three red, green, and blue channels at once, but our individual red, green, and blue channels as well. So we've got lots and lots of power in here and lots to explore when we do our dedicated deep dive on this panel in the coming weeks here on the channel. So for today, that's a really good overview of everything that I want you to understand about the Curves panel inside of Resolve, the conventions that it uses, how to navigate the Curves panel, find what you're looking for, know that you've found the right thing, and how to start to make changes within each of these panels. And we're now going to focus on looking at each of these tools in detail, what we can use them for, how they're best used, and some of my favorite tricks for getting the very best out of my images using each of these custom tools. So I hope that's a helpful start, and we're going to dive in deeper from here and really take a look at all of the possibilities within our Curves panel here inside of Resolve.